Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our comprehensive study of cultural criticism. Over the next 3 hours, we're going to explore one of the most transformative and essential intellectual approaches for understanding our contemporary world. Let me walk you through what we will be covering today. Our course is structured around 15 major sections, each building upon the previous one to give you a complete understanding of cultural criticism, theory, and practice. We'll begin by the course outline, Introduction to Cultural Criticism, the historical context of cultural criticism, major theoretical approaches in cultural criticism in practice, analyzing media and the literature, the role of context, new historicism and cultural materialism, eu- Eurocentrism and expanding perspectives, skills development, critical thinking, and cultural awareness, theories and critics to know, analytical framework, visual and interactive elements, assessment applying cultural criticism, real-world impact of cultural criticism, challenges and critics of cultural criticism, future directions in cultural criticism, conclusion, becoming a cultural critic. Now let's go to the introduction to cultural criticism. Cultural criticism represents a fundamental shifts in how we understand and interpret the world around us rather than treating literature, art, and media as isolated aesthetic objects. Cultural criticism insists that we examine them within their social, political, and historical contexts. This approach reveals how cultural narratives do not simply reflect society, they actively shape it, constructing our understanding of power, identity, and values. A Hollywood film isn't just entertainment, it's teaching audiences about gender roles, racial hierarchies, what counts as normal or deviant. And advertisement isn't just selling products, it's selling ideologies about happiness, success, and the good life. As its core, cultural criticism asks essential questions. Who gets to tell stories? Whose experiences are centered or marginalized? What assumptions about race, gender, class, and power are embedded in cultural products? By integrating these questions, cultural criticism moves beyond passive consumption toward active, engaged analysis. You're not just watching a film or reading a book, you're analyzing how it works, what ideologies it carries, what cultural work it performs. It's crucial to distinguish cultural criticism from cynicism. While cynicism dismisses culture with broad, sweeping judgments, cultural criticism employs informed, nuanced analysis grounded in theoretical frameworks and historical understanding. The cultural critic doesn't simply reject or accept. Instead, they investigate, contextualize, and eliminate the complex ways meaning is constructed and contested. A cultural critic might analyze a problematic film with acknowledging what it does well, recognizing its contradictions, understanding the conditions that produce it, and examining both its harmful elements, its potential for resistant readings. This is sophisticated, difficult work that respects complexity. The intellectual lineage of cultural criticism includes towering figures who transformed how we think about culture. Raymond Williams sensed that culture isn't something remote or elite, but rather the whole way of life of a society. Edward Said demonstrated how Western representations of the Orient revealed more about imperial power than about actual cultures. Michael Foucault showed how the scores itself, the systems of language and knowledge we use expresses power by determination, what can be said, taught, and known. These thinkers laid the foundations for contemporary cultural criticism, focus on power, representations, and ideology. They told us that culture isn't innocent, that representation matters, that knowledge and power are inseparable. Now let's go to the definition examines culture within social, political, and historical context. Purpose reveals how narratives shape our identity and values. Distinction, informed analysis, not dismissive judgment. Now let's move to the learning objectives, understanding its role in analyzing cultural texts and artifacts with their social contexts, explore key approaches, including feminist, Marxist, and post-colonial frameworks, examine texts through lenses of race, gender, class, and power dynamics, uncover biases and societal influences shaping cultural production. Now let's go for learning outcomes. Claire explain what cultural criticism is, why it matters, and how it differs from other forms of analysis. You'll be able to contextualize cultural criticism within broader intellectual traditions, show mastery of key cultures, criticism theories, including feminist, Marxist, and post-colonial approaches. You'll understanding how each theory emerged and what questions it seeks to answer. Graphically, issues cultures texts by considering their historical, social, and political contexts. You'll recognize how meaning is constructed through complex interactions between text and context, produce sophisticated analysis that uncover underlying power structures and cultural assumptions. You'll identify whose interests are served and whose voices are marginalized. Engage in meaningful self reflection about your own cultural opposition or position and how it shapes your interpretations. You'll develop awareness of your bias and assumptions. Now let's move to the historical context and the cultural criticism. Cultural criticism emerged in the late 20th century as scholars grew increasingly dissatisfied with formalist literary analysis, which treats texts as self-contained aesthetic objects disconnected from the world that produced them. This older approach, epitomized by new criticism, insisted on close reading, focused exclusively on literary technique, metaphor, imagery, structure, while deliberately excluding considerations of authorial intent, historical context, or social meaning. New critics would say, do not worry about what the author meant or what was happening historically. Just look at the text itself, analyze the metaphors, the symbol, the imagery. This produced valuable closed reading, but it ignored the crucial dimensions of meaning. The shift from text-centered to text-centered analysis represented a profound epistemological change. Cultural critics argue that meaning doesn't reside solely within texts. but emerged from complex interactions between texts, authors, audiences, and the broader cultural systems in which they circulate. A novel isn't just an arrangement of words on a page, it's a cultural intervention shaped by and responding to specific historical conditions, power relations, and ideological struggles. Then this shift opened up literature and culture to much richer, more complex analysis. Now let's move to the historical context timeline of development. 1960s to 1970s, post structuralism challenges fixed meaning and stable interpretations. Scholars begin questioning who determines what texts mean and whose interests rational interpretations serve. 1970s to 1980s, critical theory, particularly the Frankfurt School's analysis of culture industries demonstrates how mass culture can serve ideological functions and then maintain existing power structures. 1980s to 1990s. Um, Cultural studies emerged as an interdisciplinary field, bringing together literary analysis, sociology, anthology, and political economy to study cultural production and consumption. 1990s to present time, cultural criticism expands to encompass digital media, globalization, and the transitional flows of culture while maintaining focus on power and representation. These tools have been adapted for new media, but the core concerns remain. This timeline shows cultural criticism as dynamic, always evolving in response to new cultural phenomena and theoretical developments. Now let's go to Foucault's discourse theory. Michael Foucault's discourse theory proved especially influential in this transformation. Foucault agreed that discourse, the system of language knowledge and the practice that organize how we understand the world, isn't neutral or transparent. Instead, discourse is intimately connected to power. What can be said? Who has authority to speak? What counts as knowledge and what remains unspeakable are all determined by power relations. Cultural critics thus analyze not just what cultural texts say, but what systems of power and knowledge make certain statements possible while rendering others impossible or illegitimate. When you watch a news broadcast, ask who's speaking, from what position of authority, what assumptions are they making, what perspectives are executed or excluded, what makes their statements count as legitimate knowledge. This focal Foucauldian discourse analysis applied to everyday culture. This historical shift fundamentally changed what it means to study culture. The culture critic's task isn't simply to appreciate beauty or decode symbols, but to investigate how cultural products participate in broader cycles over meaning, identity, and power. Every cultural text becomes a site where social conflicts play out, where dominant ideologies are reproduced or contested, where hierarchies are reinforced or challenged. Think about a romantic comedy, for example. Traditional criticism might analyze its plot structure, character development, use of humor. Cultural criticism asks different questions. What gender roles does this film naturalize? What assumptions about class does it make? Notice how rom-com characters often have impossible, expensive apartments. What racial dynamics does it produce? How many rom-coms center people of color versus white characters? Does it challenge or reinforce heteronormal normativity, heteronormativity. Now let's move to major theoretical approaches in cultural criticism. Cultural criticism encompasses multiple uh, cultural criticism encompasses multiple theoretical frameworks, each offering distinct perspectives on how culture operates and what critical questions to ask rather than competing approaches. These theories provide complementary lenses that eliminate different dimensions of cultural texts and praxis. Understanding these major approaches equip you with a versatile analytical toolkit. You'll be able to choose appropriate frameworks for particular texts and the questions. Sometimes feminist analysis is most illuminating. Other times, Marxist or post-colonial approaches reveal more. Often, combining frameworks produce the richest insights. Now, let's go to feminist criticism. Examine how patriarchy and gender oppression manifest in cultural texts. Feminist critics analyze representations of women, expose sexist assumptions, investigate how gender roles are constructed and neutralized, and recover marginalized women's voices and perspectives. Traditional canons often excluded women writers or paid more attention to male authorized texts. Feminist critics recover women's writing, showing rich literary traditions that were marginalized or forgotten. Now let's go to Marxist criticism, analyze how economic forces and the classic struggle influence cultural production. Marxist critics examine how culture reflects and reinforces capitalist ideology, investigate relationships between base economic structure and superstructure culture, and reveal class interests embedded in texts. Who benefits from this representation? Whose interests does it serve? How does it portray working class versus wealthy characters? Does it naturalize inequality or critique it? Now let's move to post-colonial criticism, explores effects of colonialism and cultural imperialism on both colonizers and colonized. Post-colonial critics analyze how colonial power relations shape representation, investigate processes of othering and Orientalism, and highlight voices from formerly colonized people. Both colonial criticism centers writers and thinkers from Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, those who experienced colonialism's effects and who offer perspectives that differ from Western viewpoints. Now let's move to critical race theory. Investigates race, systematic racism, and representation in cultural criticism. Race theorist examines how racism operates through institutions and cultural narratives, analyze racial stereotypes and their effects, and center perspectives of people of color. For too long, discussions of race centered white perspectives, what white people think about race, how white people experience diversity. Critical race theory says centers those who experience racism directly, listen to Black voices, Indigenous voices, Asian American voices, Latin voices. Now let's move to eco criticism. Consider environmental themes and the human nature relationships in culture. Eco-critics analyze how texts represent natural and environmental crises, investigate anthropocentric assumptions, and explore connections between ecological and social justice. Environmental destruction disproportionately affects marginalized communities. Poor neighborhoods face more pollution, endangered communities lose lands to extraction. Developing nations face climate impacts they didn't primarily cause. Eco-criticism shows how environmental and social justice interconnects. Now let's move to the major approaches. So each theoretical approach asks distinctive questions and highlights different aspects of cultural texts. A feminist critic might ask how a film represents women and gender relations. A Marxist critic might investigate what economic systems the same film neutralizes. A postcolonial critic might explore how it portrays cultural difference. These perspectives aren't mutually exclusive. Indeed, the chest um, analysis often synthesize multiple theoretical lenses to capture the complexity of cultural products. You might combine feminist and postcolonial approaches to examine how women of color are represented differently from white women. You might merge Marxist and eco-critical analysis to show how capitalism drives environmental destruction. Now let's go to intersectionality. Contemporary cultural criticism increasingly emphasizes intersectionality, recognizing that systems of oppression interconnect. Gender cannot be analyzed separately from race, class, or sexuality. People occupy multiple social positions simultaneously, experiencing overlapping forms of privilege and marginalization. This intersectional approach produces more nuanced sophisticated analysis that reflect the complexity of lived experience. Single axis frameworks analyzing only gender or only race or only class miss how these systems work together. Now let's go to the cultural criticism in practice analyzing media and literature. So, theory becomes powerful when applied to concrete cultural texts. Let's examine how different critical lenses illuminate specific cultural products, revealing meanings and ideologies that might otherwise remain invisible. These case studies demonstrate the practical value of cultural criticism for making sense of the media environment we inhabit. Let me walk you through several case studies showing how different theoretical frameworks reveal meanings and ideology that might otherwise remain invisible. Pay attention to the methodology, how critics move from theory to textual analysis to broader conclusions. Now let's go to case study one, feminist critic of 1950s advertising. Advertisements from the 1950s provide striking examples of how media reproduces gender ideology. These ads constantly portrayed women in the domestic spaces defined by their relationships to men and children and valued primarily for physical appearance. A feminist analysis reveals how such representations neutralized patriarchal gender roles, constructing proper femininity as submissive, decorative, and domestic. Betty Frieden's The Feminine Mistake offered groundbreaking criticism of this cultural moment, documenting how media created a narrow sophisticating vision of women's lives. Contemporary feminist critics continue this work, analyzing how advertising has evolved while often reproducing similar gender assumptions to or in updated forms. Today's ads might show women in professional settings, but still often emphasize physical appearance, sexual appeal to men, and domestic competence. The form change, but underlying ideologies persist. Case study 2: Critical Race Theory and Contemporary Film. Critical race theory applied to contemporary film and television reveals ongoing patterns of racial representation. Despite some progress, studies document resistant under representation of people of color, stereotypical characterizations, and narratives that center wider perspectives, even in stories about racial issues. Critics analyze phenomena like white savior narratives, where white characters rescue people of color, centering white racism rather than the agency of marginalized groups. They investigate how seemingly progressive texts can reduce and reproduce racial hierarchy through subtle representational choices. This criticism has influenced industry practice and audience awareness. Hashtags like hashtag Oscars so white drew attention to ongoing exclusion. Audiences increasingly call out problematic representations. Writers' rooms are becoming more diverse. Change is slow, but critical analysis derives it by making invisible patterns visible. Now let's move to oppositional readings. Stewart Hall's encoding decoding model demonstrates that audiences do not passively receive dominant meanings. Marginalized groups often engage in oppositional readings, interpreting texts against their intended grain. For example, LGBTQ plus audiences have long found queer subtext in mainstream media, reading against heteronormative assumptions to find representations of their experiences. When same-sex friendship in films or TV shows is portrayed with intense emotional bonds, physical closeness, devotion, queer audiences, just friendship. This isn't reading too much in it to it. It's survival strategy, finding yourself in cases that officially deny your existence. Now let's move to practical activity. Exercise select a current of viral video or commercial, apply at least two critical lenses to deconstruct it, consider what assumptions about gender, race, or class does it make, whose perspective is centered, what ideologies does it neutralize, what would an oppositional reading look like. Share your analysis with classmates to see how different perspectives illuminate different meaning. This is where learning deepens when someone with different background or using different frameworks sees something you missed, your understanding expands. Now let's move to the role of context to new historism and cultural materialism, two influential approaches. New historism and cultural materialism particularly emphasize the importance of historical and material context in shaping cultural production. These frameworks reject the notion that texts transcend their historical moments, instead insisting that understanding requires examining specific conditions of production, and reception. What was happening in Elizabethan England, what anxieties did audiences bring, what cultural work did these plays perform in their moments. Now let's go to new historism. Emerging in the 1980s, new historism treats literary texts as cultural artifacts inseparable from the historical power relations that produced them, associated with scholars like Stephen Greenblatt. This approach refuses to privilege literary texts over other historical documents, and instead it reads literary works alongside legal texts, political pamphlets, diaries, and other archival materials to understand the cultural work texts performed in their historical moment. For example, analyzing Shakespeare's The Tempest, a new historist um, a new historist might read it alongside accounts of New World exploration, documents about English colonization efforts, reports of Native American peoples' royal proclamation about territorial claims, all the diverse texts circulating in early 17th century England. Now let's move to new historism um, continued. New historism or new historicists emphasize that history isn't simply background for texts, it's constitutive of their meanings. A Shakespeare play doesn't reflect Elizabethan England, it actively participates in that cultural negotiations over power, authority, and identity. Understanding the play requires understanding the specific historical conflicts it engages in the anxieties it manages and the ideological work it performs. For example, The Tempest isn't just a fantasy about a magician on an island. In engaging with contemporary anxieties about colonization, about European claims to rule over indigenous people, about what makes authority legitimate, about whether native people are fully human. The play doesn't simply reflect these debates, it intervenes in them, takes positions, does cultural work. Now let's move to cultural materialism. Cultural materialism developed by British scholars like Raymond Williams and Jonathan Dolimo combines Marxist analysis with cultural studies to investigate material conditions of cultural production. This approach examines not just texts themselves, but the economic systems, institutions, and social relations through which culture is produced, disturbed, or distributed and consumed. Culture doesn't float free of material conditions. It's produced by people working in specific economic circumstances, distributed through institutions with particular interests, consumed by audiences with varying degrees of access and cultural capital. Now let's move to the focus on material conditions, talking about cultural materialism. Cultural materialism analyze questions like who owns media companies and what interests do they serve? How do economic constraints shape what can be produced? How do educational institutions determine which texts become canonical, what materials and conditions enable or constrain audiences' interpretations. This focus on material conditions grounds cultural analysis in concrete social realities rather than abstract ideas. Cultural materialism refuses to treat culture as realm or pure in ideas separate from economic and social relations. Instead, it insisted that cultural is material, produced through labor, distributed through economic systems shaped by an institutional power consumed in specific material circumstances. Now let's go to example Shakespeare The Tempest. First, historical context Shakespeare The Tempest is the context of English colonialism, power relations, the play's representation of Prospero's mastery and the Calibian's subjection, colonial ideology, how the text naturalizes European dominance over colonized people. Prosperous claims the island through his superior magic civilization. He treats Calibian as Sophoman, calling him savage, slave, monster. Prospero believes he is rightfully civilizing Calibian by teaching him language and attempting to improve him. Conquest and power historical narratives. History is written by the winners. This common saying points to crucial questions. Whose version of events becomes the official narrative? Whose experiences are recorded and whose are erased? What perspectives are legitimized and what voices are silenced? Cultural critics recognize that historical narratives are always selective, shaped by power relations. Examining cultural texts from the past requires asking how and whose interests particular representations served and what alternative perspectives might have been suppressed. When we read historical novels, watch period dramas, study old films, we must ask whose history is this? Who gets to be the hero? Whose experiences are centered? What has been left out? Understanding context transforms interpretation. The same text means differently when read in light of the specific historical struggles that shaped it. Cultural critics do not treat context as background information. They analyze how texts and contexts mutually constitute each other, how cultural products both reflect and shape the social worlds they inhabit. Now let's go to the Eurocentrism and expanding perspectives. Traditional cultural criticism, particularly in Western academia, has often suffered from Eurocentric bias, privileging European and North American cultures, theories, and perspectives while marginalizing or ignoring non-Western traditions. This bias isn't merely an oversight, it reflects and produces colonial power relations, suggesting that only Western thought constitutes legitimate knowledge while rendering other intellectual traditions invisible or primitive. Think about it. Whose theories do we study? Mostly European and American thinkers. Marx, Freud, Foucault, American feminists, whose literature is considered world literature. This proportionately Western texts with non-Western texts treated as exotic additions rather than equally central. Now let's go to Edward Said's Orientalism. Recognizing and critiquing Eurocentrism is essential for developing a more inclusive, sophisticated cultural criticism. Edward Said's Orientalism demonstrated how Western scholarship about the Orient revealed more about Western fantasies and imperial ambitions than about actual Asian and Middle Eastern cultures. Said showed how apparently objective scholarship participated in colonial domination by constructing the East as exotic, irrational, and backward, the opposite of the supposedly rational, progressive West. This construction justified imperial domination. These irrational, backward people needed Western civilization, needed to be ruled for their own good. Now let's go to expanding perspectives, diverse voices. African perspectives. Scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong's and Chuna Achebe critic colonial education and Central African epistemologies. Middle Eastern critics, intellectuals like Layla Ahmed and Fatima Mernissi, analyze gender and cultural from Islamic perspectives. Asian theorists, thinkers like Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha develops post-colonial theory examining hybridity and subalternity. Latin American voices, scholars like Gloria Anzaldúa or Anzoldo, theorize borderlands consciousness and the mestiza identity. Indigenous knowledge, native scholars like Linda to Hewi, Smith critic Western research and assert indigenous methodologies. Ways of knowing grounded in indigenous worldviews rather than Western epistemology. Now let's go to benefits of expanding perspectives. Expanding cultural criticism beyond Eurocentric boundaries enriches analysis in modern ways. It reveals how cultural process operates differently across contexts, challenges assumptions about universal truth or natural cultural development, exposes how power shapes what counts as knowledge and provides access to alternative frameworks for understanding culture and society. Non-Western traditions offer concepts, theories, and approaches that enrich cultural criticism. Why limit uh, ourselves to Western frameworks when human intellectual diversity offers so much more? So let's move now to questioning methodologies and epistemologies. For students critically examining Eurocentric or Eurocentrism means questioning not just the content but methodologies and epistemologies. What ways of knowing are privileged in academia, whose experiences are treated as universal versus particular, what languages and publication venues are considered prestigious, how do institutional structures reproduce cultural hierarchies. Who gets hired in universities? Who research gets funded? what theories get taught, what texts make it onto syllabi. These institutional decisions, shaped by power, reproduce ecocentrism when or even when individuals have good intentions. Now let's move to rethinking assumption or rethinking assumptions. Importantly, expanding perspectives doesn't mean simply adding non-Western thinkers to existing frameworks. It requires fundamentally rethinking assumptions about cultural knowledge and the criticism itself. Students should investigate their own cultural contexts critically, recognizing how local perspectives offer unique insights, often obscured by dominant Western frameworks. You do not need to adopt Western theories wholesale. You can adapt them, transform them, or develop alternatives grounded in your own cultural traditions. We will stop here. We will continue inshallah next session. Until next time, tata for now.